Hello and welcome to my channel. I've been trying to resuscitate this channel for quite a while, but so many things have been getting in the way. This particular video I actually recorded before in full and everything was perfect according to me. And turns out my mic was actually off, so it didn't pick up any audio. So now I'm trying again, and there are children screaming in the background. But I just have to get this done, otherwise it might never happen. So please do bear with me. My light also seems to be doing something in my glasses, but again, I'm just going to leave it and keep going. So today I wanted to talk about something that I've been thinking about a lot. So I'm starting a new series that I'm calling the cPTSD Diaries. And something I've been thinking about a lot as someone who has cPTSD and identifies as being queer is how, and for those who don't know, cPTSD is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. It's basically a result of prolonged trauma, particularly childhood trauma, and it really, for me personally, affects the nervous system, can cause a lot of anxiety and mental health and day-to-day challenges, and also relational challenges. I will talk a lot more about it. I have a blog where I talk about it, and I'm going to be doing so on my channel. But I've been thinking a lot about how having this kind of on-edge, frazzled nervous system has affected my experience of being queer. So this will be like a story time and also just my personal reflections. There's a lot of shame as a core aspect or a core wound when it comes to cPTSD. And then tying this in with particular traumas and shame that have to do with sexuality and attachment attempts has kind of been a really interesting concoction from my lived experience of it. So just a trigger warning, I guess. I will be mentioning sexuality and relationships and also some examples of sexual trauma. I don't know what YouTube flags or doesn't flag these days, but I'm just going to go with it. So developing in a body where being controlled and punished and shamed was the norm, primarily in my family system, but also with religion and culture. And with pleasure, any type of pleasure, but of course, especially sexuality, having negative outcomes, I kind of internalized beliefs that even to this day take a lot of work to kind of get myself out of. Maybe we can just talk about my experience of being a woman before even getting to the queer aspect. So, growing up, everything I did was often framed around this idea that you're a girl and this is how girls should act, and a lot of punishment for not fitting into that mold, which I didn't do often. Yeah, I was always perceived, particularly by my mother, as a very difficult daughter, having my own opinions about the messed up patriarchal system that we live in general, but also in our particular household, and having my own aspirations, needs, and desires that often felt overwhelming and frightening and triggering for her. And then, of course, the controlling patriarchs in my family as well. Just that in itself was quite an intense experience. And then when it comes to sexuality, the assumption was being heterosexual, but even that was highly shamed. At home and at school, actually, there was a lot of don't do boys. I don't know what it means to do boys, they're drugs. Maybe they are. Anyway, yeah, or even self-pleasure. I remember my mom would get suspicious that I was exploring myself when I was a teenager, and would lose her mind and want to see very private aspects of my body and what I'm doing with myself. So yeah, there was a lot there from a very young age. So I moved cities a lot and schools a lot, but I went to, like, my first school was an all-girls Catholic school, which in itself was traumatizing. And then when I moved schools when I was younger as well in primary school, that was my first experience at a co-ed school. And when I got there was a lot of, like, everyone was making a big deal about how I was now going to be learning with these boys who were a big deal throughout. Yeah, and like there was always talk about like these shameful, dirty girls with their boyfriends from the time I was young till like teenagehood and beyond. And like just basic affection, not even getting to the sexual part yet, just basic affection and care and relationships were highly shamed and also viewed in a way as naive and silly. So yeah, when I did move to this co-ed school, I was such a timid person by this point because of a lot of the emotional, verbal, and physical abuse that was going on at home. So I struggled a lot in general, but then I had definitely shut down the normal developmental aspect of having crushes, etc., up until then because it was so ingrained that that was bad. And that was also the time of like purity culture and saving yourself for the Lord, because my family was Christian. I had no choice about it at that point. And we learned about that very early. Like we had to sign contracts like about saving our bodies for the Lord, and our husbands, which was the goal. Societally, or at school at least, at home, it was just like, don't think about these creatures. But then the standard is, of course, being hit. So yeah, still just being in this new novel experience. The school was such a caring and loving environment. I did open up a bit, and I didn't let intentionally, but naturally, my human instincts would kick in from time to time, and I would develop like small crushes and my brain would instantly like shut that down. And then the one I did let myself entertain was this boy when I was about 11, 12. And yeah, my mom found out about it and berated me in public about it. And this was just like a crush. Like, it was a whole rage filled experience that I just blocked that entire experience out of my head. And then, like, my first crush before that was a girl, and obviously that was just, I didn't know anything about that. It didn't seem like a possibility and I didn't understand. Also, my first kiss was a girl. So all of my firsts actually across the board were women or girls. But then like with this boy, I was like, okay, finally, this is normal. Let me allow myself to like indulge in this little crush that all the kids were doing because it was such a big deal. Everyone wanted to know who's your little boyfriend, and for the guys, who's your little girlfriend. And I was finally making friends and wanted to fit in and belong, and then that was instantly like shamed and attacked. So I just blocked that experience out. And then a year or two later, when I then went to high school, which I went back to an only girls' school, lo and behold, my entire sexual existence opened up. So yeah, when I got to high school, it was the time of like Wattpad and smut books and after and all these mafia stories of like men dominating and high-key abusing women and this being romanticized and glorified. So yeah, my world was opened up to an array of wild things. Like from the moment I entered the gates of high school, it was kind of like a welcome, this is what's going on here. And yeah, so it took a while for me to like settle in again. I'd kind of gone back to like being a little timid and not being sure how to fit in and make friends because most of my friends from primary school had gone to different schools. And by the second year in, I had developed this massive crush on this girl. Yeah, so that was just like a basic crush, but then I also had like a very sexually charged crush on one of my teachers she was very androgynous and just all around my type. Now I'm very aware. Yeah, but like these were kind of like the most okay experiences for me internally, in the sense that they weren't shamed and I mostly kept them to myself. My one friend I did tell about the crushes. She was like not too bothered, not too unbothered. It was just like neutral, which wasn't harmful in any way. But like my actual first experiences in relationships and sexually were all traumatic. So before this, when I was younger, my cousin who was the same age as me, I don't know how much I can say and can't say on YouTube, but yeah, she was like, we were in this room playing alone, as they usually do, leave kids to play alone, and she was the same age as me, so it took a while for me to process that I was violated in any sense, because I was like, how does a child violate a child? And that's a whole topic of its own. But yeah, she was my introduction to like, what's a non-explicit term for crasturbation? It rhymes with that. Not that it's crass, that was just a random example. But yeah, and she kind of like did it to me and herself, and I had no idea what was going on. But that was my first experience of that, or awareness of my, well, it wasn't the first awareness of like my private parts, because that was always shamed and spoken about, and my mom loved raging about how dirty female bodies are. Anyway, yeah, and then much later, because throughout high school I did kind of just like, that was like the most intense in terms of sexual like controlling. I didn't get into like any relationships or anything like that. I just kept my Wattpad and personal fantasies to myself, which most of the girls I hang out with were doing anyway when I had friends. And then like at the very end of high school, in my gap year, that was when like I got into like my first relationship, lo and behold, with a narcissist. Yeah, so I was a late bloomer, as apparently they called, and he full on raped me. So that was like another negative first experience. So like none of my major firsts in that arena were pleasant, to say the least. So I already had this sense of trauma and shame from this developmental trauma. But then now I had this specifically like sexual shame, like even after like the rape experience. I went through so much that I never told anyone about, because that was like life and death. And I just didn't really have anyone. That was the first time I started like forming a community outside of like having left school and outside of my family, and I had to lose all of that with this experience. Yeah, sorry, I didn't think I would get emotional. I'm not getting too emotional, but I am responding as human beings do to the memory. Yeah, so that was not good. But even like beyond this, throughout high school and just my school life in general, because of just the person I had developed into, who I mentioned was quite timid and etc., I wasn't easy to pick on. I got bullied a lot, and even without knowing how, I would always be like attacked for standing out, and like that was always a core pain point of mine. Like anytime someone would just perceive me as not normal, it got to the point much later where I just wanted to be normal so bad. Like one of my mom's biggest issues with me was that I was weird, and I'm pretty sure she even said queer without realizing what it meant to me, and I was like, yay. Yeah, she was very uncomfortable with, my whole family was anything that didn't fit the standard traditional fake image, despite how toxic they were behind closed doors. And then in high school, like I was just myself when I did open up and express myself, and apparently that was not acceptable in so many situations, especially with the how a girl should be, which wasn't even anything drastic. It was just like insane policing of insane standards of femininity and female bodies and expressions. So yeah, like after high school, like when I was a young adult, it got to a point where all I wanted to do was like just be normal. And having shame already and being picked on to be punished or to be projected onto already being part of my nervous system and something I actively wanted to avoid, I ended up hating so many of the parts of myself that made me not normal, and that made me like stand out. And being queer being one of these parts of me, and like I would always have to ask, like, why do I have to be queer? Why do I have to be so sensitive? Why do I have to have this emotional landscape? Why do I have to have this mind that works this way? And then even with choices that I made, but still, like, it felt like I couldn't be any other way because that's who I was. And I'm just someone who's always wanted to be myself. Like, why did I have to be someone with these preferences and these lifestyle choices? I have so many lifestyle choices that are absurd to people, even to the most basic of like being vegetarian for some reason was such a huge deal, which, to be fair, I live in an African context, and in my country in particular, it's like a sin to not eat meat. Jokingly, of course. That's like a small example, but so many of my other lifestyle choices now are suddenly acceptable, and everyone's like, this might actually be a good idea, let's explore this. But then, especially in high school, everyone was just like, bro, what is wrong with you? Like, so that was such a wound that when I became a young adult, I just wanted so bad to fit in that I went out of my way to try and get this level of femininity that was like acceptable. There were some people in particular who like bullied the shit out of me that were my friends, claimed to be my friends, that kind of contributed to that. I do feel like this one girl would always comment about my body, and like people, adults and young people, were always commenting on women's, young girls' bodies in a way that, looking back, is just sad and inappropriate. But then there's also this boy who would always like be like, do you comb your hair, and like pick about my body, but then like when he gets home be actually asking me to send him nudes for like a year straight. In fact, more than a year. I just realized that he and many of the people who caused some suffering in my life had his own issues and internal conflicts that I was just a curious place to project or try and navigate rather than in himself or in themselves for everyone else. Yeah, so that kind of led to me getting into the very toxic modeling industry, which was so toxic on the part of the girls, like how the girls were treated and how they were made to treat each other. One positive aspect was getting this queer representation, particularly with males, unfortunately only with them. And like I'm a creative person in general, so I was already in like a lot of these creative spaces with like queer men, but like not many queer women. And in the modeling space, definitely didn't meet any queer women, but like a lot of queer men. But that was so toxic. Like even my one instructor would be like, why don't you just blend in? Why are you always trying to fit in? And that was like, again, a trauma. And I was always trying to prove like I'm just normal. And I wouldn't be trying to stick out, but it was just like a recurring thing. And it sucked. With any natural expression of mine or any natural desire, like liking a girl, being attracted to a girl. I was single for a long time after the rape just because I couldn't bear. But even that would just trigger like intense anxiety and shame and just not knowing what to do with myself. That's why I'm pretty sure. Like from the time I was like 16 till like 23, I dealt with a lot of like, to be straight, like suicidality and depression and anxiety and like poetry, which I started this channel doing almost 10 years ago, is really what like got me through. But yeah, having this home environment, this cultural environment, this general global societal perspective, being who I was and also having the history that I had was just like, I was like, why did I have to get this combination of cards, like of all the cards that I could have been dealt? Just a perfect storm. And it's interesting seeing the intersection of all these things and how it has affected me. So I became really good at like compartmentalizing and pretending and masking. And like because of the way I was raised, I was such an overachiever. When I eventually gave up being like perfect and standard normal in the sense of who I am, I still like chased that professionally. So I got into, at an early age, these professional spaces where I was often the youngest. And even then I would be picked on by like grown men and women who for some reason were threatened by me. But like that became my focus, and I kind of put relationships to the sideline because with cPTSD, that's already, for me personally, and having a disorganized attachment style, the most challenging aspect of life is like relationships. Like career, I can handle that. I can compartmentalize. I can focus. I can be who I'm needed to be and feel okay, even if I feel numbed out. But relationships, like before the queer trauma and every other sexual trauma, like just relationships in general, as someone with cPTSD and a disorganized attachment, have always been like primary pain points. So yeah, I just put that to the sidelines for a while. But because I am human, I did have to indulge in a few situationships and all the toxic shit that make you a young person. And even then I noticed how my history of being shamed and punished affected that. In particular, my sexual choices. Like, I realized how pleasure, just like, not even that it's ingrained that it's bad for a woman to enjoy another woman conceptually, but on the pleasure level, because I had internalized that pleasure itself leads to negative consequences. Something really interesting happened that I notice in hindsight. Like, I've never orgasmed like with a man, mostly because most of them were inattentive and like only cared about themselves. I think I have once actually, and I've only had one male partner who, like, not just where it was mutual. Like, in most cases, they always feel amazing, and I don't. But I've had like only one out of everything, like where I was mutually like happy. But then I became more comfortable with male partners because pleasure was so shamed. And I think maybe it's because women know each other's bodies because we have the same body parts usually and like same emotional workings and minds. It's always good with women, like just relationships and interactions with women always feels wonderful. It was more like it's bad to love a woman because of how good it feels. Like there's that element of it as well. So this element of like, I've been told sex is bad already and sexuality is bad already. At least if I experience it, for example, with like cis het men and I don't enjoy it, then at least I've still done this bad thing, but like didn't even feel good. And that was like rational to me versus like doing this bad thing and gosh, it feels great too. Now it's even more shame and even more sense of like, you filthy girl. And I like a filthy girl. Yeah, and that's just been also an interesting observation, like this aversion to pleasure and hence aversion to the relationships that give me the most pleasure and satisfaction emotionally, mentally, physically, because pleasure became tied to this dysregulated nervous system response, and pain actually, and discomfort and emotional torment and physical torment even to an extent became associated with comfort because it was like, this is familiar, I know this, I get this. But the ultimate issue, I would say, with like these men most of the time was the fact that they weren't queer, and maybe that wouldn't have been a big of a deal if they weren't such homophobic individuals, and that's usually when the relationship ended, who did not accept, like, because when you're with someone, like, you want to share all parts of yourself and your desires, etc., and like just the fact that I liked women too would like to them emasculate them, whatever bullshit that means. And I just couldn't handle that, more so than the dissatisfying emotional life, mental life, and sex life. It was actually that was just like, I can't do this. And also just like the fact that because I didn't really know many queer men who were like bi or pansexual. Like the only queer men I knew were like into men. So it was just like straight options, and like it's just so different because I'm queer no matter who I'm with, and like my style of relationships is queer and doesn't fit the traditional patriarchal mold, whereas with these straight men I would be forced into these boxes again. That just took me back to like my teenage girl life in the house and at school, and it was just like that was the main trauma point that I couldn't handle, but more so than everything else. So in a way it was a gift because it stopped me from bearing the unbearable, just because that particular aspect that created so many flashbacks that I just couldn't bear. So yeah, as is often the case with complex PTSD and disorganized attachment, there were a lot of these contradictions where a lot of my trauma was not belonging, and then me just wanting to be in situations that made me feel like I belonged in the normal sense, and then entering these situations and then being like traumatized again, or reminded of the sense of who I am being completely picked apart and shattered and like being confined, and that then making me want to get out of it. So it's like in it I suffer, out of it I suffer kind of situation. And I think that's really what got me into like trauma work and psycho education and mindfulness practices and everything that I eventually got into, because I think the only reasonable option was like to work on my wounds so that they don't affect me being who I want to be and who I know I am, rather than changing who I am to for the sake of being able to live with minimal discomfort with my unaddressed traumas and wounds. Yeah, I don't know if I said that clearly. But yeah, all of these negative experiences, some of which I've described today, and there are many more, kind of stay in the body and live in the nervous system and creates like this, for me it's particularly a freeze response and a fawn response. So like in relation to like my sexuality, a freeze response with the women in the sense of like that deep attraction, and then immediately being like, this is, I don't think it consciously that this is not allowed at all anymore, but like just that immediate response of like being paralyzed because it's too much. And then with like the few men, even with the one where it wasn't a good, it was like a situationship and it wasn't like a good interaction emotionally, but like mentally definitely matched, and like the sexual attraction was like the one out of all the ones I can count, with a man like was like, okay, this is top tier enough to compare with anyone, like regardless of the gender, which is usually not the case, because it's just true, like maybe it's just the men here are just not educated unlike women. So even with a good experience like that, there was like freeze sexually, but then out of the sexual experience there was like fawn, because of like that triggered point of like wanting to be seen as like a normal, good, feminine girlfriend type person. So yeah, those are like the two main responses that would come to play for me and these dynamics. But definitely just hypervigilance or shutdown when it came to like most aspects of sexuality, and then some aspects of emotional intimacy as well. Whatever the relationship, like whoever it is with, regardless of their gender, it's always some response to process and work through. And usually, even now, it's only after that the experience where I'm like, I was completely disassociated. After a whole relationship, I'm like, I was completely disassociated in that relationship. Or like, damn, why was I so hyper vigilant and like reaching so much in that situation with someone who did not care about my well-being at all? And these are like trauma responses that I'm still working through. But yeah, I just found it interesting looking at this intersection at a time when I've been thinking a lot about like my healing and particularly my experience with cPTSD, and also thinking about like the relationships I want to intentionally create moving forward, and how that's very different from, well, it took a while to get to a place where I no longer accept the unacceptable for myself, and realizing that this actually correlates to my experience with cPTSD, and that's probably why. But I'm happy to be where I am today, and I know that everything is a journey, and the better it gets, the better it gets. Yeah, I think the main point of doing this series is to encourage anyone who has any similar experiences with complex PTSD or any of the other things I talk about. Yeah, like with cPTSD in particular, I don't think it's talked about enough. It's good to support each other and have a community and know that we're not alone, and that there is some element of hopefulness and joy in this very often jarring and painful experience that we live within, because it's a very body-based thing and we're with ourselves for life. But yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts. Please do share any comments and thoughts whatsoever you have. And I look forward to talking more and sharing space together more on this channel and beyond. Thank you for listening. Bye. So I would actually like to end with a quote. Maybe I'll end each video with a quote that's relevant. For this one, I'd actually thought of this before recording, that I think Halsey's entire speech on being an inconvenient woman is so apt to my life experience. So I'll end with a quote from Halsey. "You were not put on this earth to make everybody's life easier. So please be inconvenient."